Okay, welcome back to the last part of the symposium. Thank you for staying here with us for such a long time. So you've already seen a lot of at least Graham and me during the last few days, and yeah, this is Gabriel for those of you who don't know him yet. Gabriel Pérez-Barreiro, the curator of the 33rd Sao Paulo Bienal. And yeah, so we wanted to take this opportunity to answer questions, to listen to comments, and also for the artists and other speakers to, you know, add anything that they might want to add. And we're here as facilitators and will eventually also add some comments and thoughts.
Can I just make a couple of practical issues? First thing I'd like to do is, can we just take a minute to thank the interpreters? They've been working in even more extreme heat than the rest of us, so I think that's important. And then for anyone who is an exclusively English speaker, in other words, if the only language you speak is English, there is a version of the protocol cards from the biennial in English for those who've come to visit for us. It's a very small edition, so please, if you don't have one of them, please come and speak to me. And we can get you one. If you would like a Portuguese language edition, please speak to the people at the Bienal. There's a protocol to be able to get that if you're a teacher or if you have interest in that material. I just wanted to make those 2 points. Thank
you. And maybe picking up on the morning conversation, we did have a bit of a round table, and there was a very kind of powerful and beautiful coming from the room of the importance of dialogue and conversation. A lot of the program, very dense, and it's been a lot of speaking out to the room. And so maybe a way we could start this would be really just to take a moment to try to hear a little bit from the room, like questions maybe that some of the members of the audience have for some of the speakers, but in order to maximize how much we can hear from the room, maybe we wait to let people answer. So we'd like to hear the questions, but would this be okay? That way we can really get, and so if people can maybe keep their contributions brief enough that we can really hear, we'll just take some time to like hear from the room. And that will get us a basket of things to think about, and then we'll have to figure out what to do with that basket together. But so, the floor is open. Oh, one more mic. Okay, great. What's on people's minds about specific talks, about the general theme?
Well, I learned so much these 3 days. First, amazing, and so connected to the whole Bienal that Gabriel curated. So one thing that I would like to hear before you all leave is how do you see the practice of attention happening in the 33rd Bienal? I know that it was part of what the concept was about, but just, you know, a response to that, kind of. Huh?
That feels like that will very much want to be a Gabriel question at a moment. So let's keep hearing. Thank you so much. Rebecca?
Would it be possible to hear closer a reiteration at some point of the conversation of the dialogue that happened this morning? It was in Portuguese, and I didn't have my headphones at the time, so I missed a good portion of that. So if someone could summarize that at some point, I think it would be helpful for other people who were perhaps not in the room at the time and hear what the critique was.
Great, great. So the person who offered those comments is here, and now everybody has their headphones, so we could hear again a little bit of that. That feels right. We shouldn't speak for you. You should speak. It was...
Boa tarde. Good afternoon. My name is Andrea. I'm a little embarrassed now. What happened this morning was that we could finally talk, and I said that we were really willing to talk every day, not only this morning or at the end of the afternoon. And I spoke in a very heated way because some people who are here, who are in the field of art, they have an understanding of the codes, of how the presentations were going to happen, and how they present a meaning that are very evident for them. But for other people who came here to this symposium, these meanings weren't evident. For instance, what is fiction and what is real. So I mentioned that I invited a friend to come here, and he came here the first day, and there are several things that were fiction and reality mixed that he couldn't distinguish which was real or not. So I thought that at the end of each activity we could talk, ask questions, get to know the process, the creative process, how you build what was done. So I also mentioned that in the first day that we were here, Stefanie talked about the importance of changing structures, how things are presented, and that it's very hard for us to talk about attention without the meaning that Raphael mentioned this morning, which is paying attention, of giving the attention to the other, and the other giving attention to us. That's the sense that we have in Portuguese and Spanish. And I mentioned also that we had this expectation of building layers of attention regarding the presentations and the work of arts that were going to happen. I said a bad thing about our work of art and a good thing about the other. I started to build these meanings during the round table. I said a bad thing that the movie that was played that showed scene of earth or sand dismantling and coming undone. I don't know if Tiago is here. I thought that the movie was nice, but I didn't like what he said afterwards. Stefanie asked him something about what he meant by something, and he said, if I knew how to speak, I wouldn't do art. And I said that was very arrogant. We are here to build an attention, a dialogue. And I didn't want to stay there and pay attention to him because he was very arrogant. And I said that artists and the speakers, in this moment that we are living right now, that when fiction and reality get together and mix to build a speech of hate and intolerance and revise the history, the neo-Nazis and so on and so forth. It was important for us to show the different ways of expression, how they work, because we have companies who pay for artists, historians like me, professionals or journalists, to build speeches that are supposedly real. Oh, well, they are real. You understood what I was trying to say, right? The speeches are real, but they change the reality for a single point of view. And we live in a country where research is showing us that 130 million people are connected through WhatsApp. Part of them are half illiterate. They don't know how to distinguish these codes, these speeches. So we need to go through a process of education and talking about these different ways of speaking. So the work of art that I liked a lot was the collectiveness that Raphael had this morning. They came here with the birds and singing, and they showed their process, what they did here at the Bienal. It was very poetic. And at the end, they passed on the birds so people could sing as well. So I think there was a very poetic moment and very important moment. We wanted to do more of that. We didn't, not only conversation, but the action of doing something that was part of something. So I mentioned those two moments of the event. something that the event was very rich as a whole, and a moment when we didn't feel welcome and a moment where we felt welcome. So thank you for your attention. Oh, and I liked a lot what Bruno Moreski said about the other biennial. So I think that we can add this different layer at the other biennial as well.
So this was touched on a bit in some of the lectures and even the Ketchum, the Estar Ser thing, but I guess what can we do with a generation whose attention spans last very few seconds as we learn how to train our brain to scroll through massive information and get these flickers? And then how do you see that being implemented into making art, or should artists be considering the ways in which somebody might only be wanting to look at something for a few seconds rather than this very meditative approach which we were exposed to through the symposium and through the artworks here?
I want to say again, it's not that we are not sort of speaking back, but we're gathering.
Thank you. I was interested to hear about other possible technologies of attention. I think in the Ketchum talk, he invented a potion which you drank and your attention somehow was changed. This is a kind of form of technology, a sort of pharmacological technology. Are there other machines, devices? Flickr was mentioned. William Burroughs and Geison's Dream Machine is a Flickr machine which maybe produces this kind of contemplative, absorptive, Whitney-esque kind of state of attention. So I'm interested in, possible other sort of real, existing or otherwise technology which can help us reclaim attention states.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you for the curatorship, organizer of the symposium, and everyone here. And I also like to say that the several speeches from everybody who presented here, they touched very different points regarding attention. And some of the speeches were contemplated what I think about that. But what the historian that just spoke, she also contemplated something that we haven't mentioned before. And that takes me, I like to carry on her, on what she said, which is the political character of attention. Because when our attention is spanned, not awake, and our perception of ourselves and the reality where we are living has been massified, I could say, that we don't end up thinking that our thoughts are numb, as Professor Maria Cristina said in the first day, and the opposite of aesthesia. And the work of art with aesthetics is to awake the thoughts, the sensations, the sensitivity, and the subject. This awakening, get awake from this state of a numbness. So I like to highlight the political character of attention. And we're living here in Brazil. What you guys who came from abroad, you're not really following up so intensely what we are living, but it's a very difficult situation, very grave situation that our country elected, or part of the voters elected the president. Sorry to say so clearly here, don't get to, and the Baiana to get involved in a fascist project, as a colleague mentioned. We are in a moment that our voice may be silenced.
I don't know if an exposition such as this one, which is being presented now, could be presented in 2 years from now in the next biennial. We have no idea what's going to happen. It might not be possible to have a biennial. So these days, I caught myself silenced. I would like to have participated and discussed in the other speeches that were given. The other presenters that were Brazilian and were here also thought it was difficult. Why aren't we having a debate? We want to debate. We are at a moment where we need to debate. Nós realmente precisamos disso agora. We really need that now. She spoke in English. It's a really strong moment within all of us now, because this debate is happening at the social medias in WhatsApp, and we like to be together with other people debating live. So I think attention is a practice of empowerment of people that's super strong. And if we really awake and become conscious, start paying attention to what we think, what we are, and how reality happens, we have the chance to actually build a world where people actually like to live, that people are not ashamed of belonging to this world. I am ashamed of belonging to a world that leaves a third of the population starving to death. I'm ashamed of this. I am ashamed to belong to a country where the politicians do what they do. I don't want to repeat everything that they do. The United States have their own particularities, which I don't have to mention here, of course, right? But what are these policies? Economical policies, social and cultural, that are being put into motion by the powerful men that are not bringing happiness to people. So attention, I believe, is the first step for any policy, which is to make people awake, for them to be awake and feeling, loving, being responsible, as our colleague mentioned before, being committed with the other 6 billion of human beings and so many other animals that live in the same planet. So I would like to see more. I would like to have this experience of a collective experience of practices of attention. That's what I have to say. And I would really like to praise the curatorship and to our friends who came from the United States and brought to us so many interesting things. But that's it. Thank you so much. Hi. It was really good to hear you speak now, because I'd really like to say, thank the symposium and everything, and really say that Brazil is going through a traumatic moment right now. A few weeks before the elections, we were very nervous, and everyone was very active. Everyone thought, each one of us thought something had to be done. Each one of us started acting in all ways possible, and it took us a long time to understand how much we had already been manipulated and how much everything had been built over the past years. And then at a second moment, some of us started to think that maybe we had had a lack of attention, because there was a lack of attention from our left wing, our left party, our left politics. For example, the evangelist movement of our country. We feel very touched and diminished by our lack of attention. At the same time, I think that we are moving towards, I believe that we're trying to correct and think and work. But I would like to mention that we created a group with some artists, psychologists, sociologists, and so on, to try to understand what is the narrative that is being built and put together, and how is it that we're going to be able to articulate ourselves. I don't know exactly how to put this, but to bring down this fascist narrative. The problem is that the fascist narrative silences everyone at all times. So I think at this moment we're going to have to create new ways of culture. This is a cultural war, among other things, but it is a cultural war. And so to wrap up, I think it was important for me. I was speaking to one of the sociologists that's working in this research group. I believe attention is one of the core points, one of the most important ones. Attention in our relationship with internet, with life, with what's real. So if you could, at any point when you're doing your research, if you become interested in wanting to help or thinking about this reality, since you also went through Trump's reality, I think Trump is very different from Bolsonaro because our institutions here in Brazil are very fragile, much more fragile than yours. But if at any moment you would like to collaborate and say something, because we're totally lost.
I'm struck by this discussion of attention and politics, which has certainly been a very intense discussion also going on in the United States all the time in this new period that we're in. And its relation to something, I wonder if Yale might at some point speak to the relation of this idea of attention in the form of obligation. So this attention, it seems possible that that could be a kind of curative approach, because it implies a duty to care whether or not you feel like it. So we don't always feel like attending to the political situation. It requires effort and ongoing internal work to bear it, because it is painful. I'm just speaking about our situation in the United States. I hear, I hear very much. I'm aware very much of the situation here too, and what that. But what I wonder if Yale could talk at some point or about the relation of ethics and politics, and the relation of this obligated attention, this caring for attention to these complex political situations.
And maybe I would also just say that among the people who have been brought by Steffi and by the biennial, it's not, we also have people from Turkey, artists from Turkey and artists from Poland, both countries that have in the last 5 years seen very dramatic and deeply troubling political change. So maybe also they would perhaps like to try to speak, just to keep calling for other And maybe we get a couple more voices keep coming, and then we try to begin to...
Thank you, Graham. And I'm from Poland, I'm from Warsaw, and we share this experience that you are starting it in Brazil right now. And it's not easy to take, it's not easy to deal with, but I think it is not only, the problem is not only ethical, but it's also an aesthetical one. And if I can say something optimistic, in this field, we win. I mean, there is no, how to say that all the world of art and this world in which we meet here today is on our side, more or less. And I think that if there is any hope of fighting global populism, it is exactly where we are here. And I think that our fight, it will not be easy to take. I don't know what will happen in Poland. We have not so much hope right now because we see what is happening. We don't know what will happen in the US. We see other countries in Europe, in Southern America, in all the continents, turning into this populist direction. And if we can only stop this, we will use this sort of moral obligation, but it is also, it can be expressed by using some sort of aesthetics. And I think that if we would like to create some sort of community, that's what keeps us together. And the thing which I found, which really is bothering me in Poland, is that we are looking for some very small differences amongst us in our group, in so-called opposition. And in the times of this sort of conflict, internal conflict of values, we are supposed, first of all, to be together. And even if I prefer something instead of something, I think that in this moment, it is not, we are not at the point of seeing small differences among us. And that's what I can say only.
Sorry to speak twice, but I keep looking at those words, the practice of attention, and even though that has been discussed over the last 3 days, I still feel a kind of gap between theories about attention and practices of attention. And so I would be interested to hear from anybody more about just very specific, literal, actual practices that either they do or they wish to invent. Like, what would be a formal political practice of attention, for instance? How can we think not only using the richness of historical practices of attention, what are the futuristic practices of attention, the Afro-futuristic practices of attention, the present experimental, avant-garde, whatever, that's really such a bad word, the present experimental wing of the practices of attention that we're a good laboratory for.
In the beginning, I just said about the practice of attention and the Bienal, but I would like to add one more thing that I would like to hear about. That is, I understand that there's a very profound political story happening in this Bienal, but that goes beyond left, or right wing, and that the practice of attention brings us to another consciousness of ourselves. I would like to understand better and to hear back from you, because just by doing some of the practices, your awareness goes to somewhere else. How is this towards, the many different political statements that I just heard?
So I want to make sure we've heard. And now maybe I ask something different, which is, who would like to try to speak? I definitely have things that I feel like I want to say in answer to this question, which feels very important, which is this question, right? So practices of attention, like those that are bound to aesthetics, the forms of criticism as an engagement that we watched in one of the talks, and the other things that we've been experimenting with over these 3 days, and that are in this biennial so deeply. We have a question, which is there a link between those activities and these deep, frightening, difficult questions of justice and violence and equity that people have spoken about so affectingly? Is there a link? Or is a meditation practice like running away from the street, the ballot box? So this is a very important question that I know. I look in the room and I see people I know care very deeply about this. I care very deeply about this. So I want to see if anybody else wants to try to speak to this. I have some things to say about this. There's a hand over here. 1, 2.
I guess I wonder if the question could be reframed, not to replace the question, but that it could be a question about the circumstances that are necessary for paying attention, for making decisions, for acting differently. What are the, what can we do? What can we do? What kinds of attention do we pay? How do we pay attention? Are maybe unanswerable before we ask the question of what is the state, like the state that Sal put us in. That was a much different state for me than maybe, that something else could, that was my brain changed, my energy changed, my circulation changed. I yawned like 50 times. And I think these are important things that happened to me. And I would like to make decisions out of that place, and I would like to maybe study practices of attending to things in that place.
Então, assistir a partir desse momento. Well, I believe that I would like to ask a question to Yael as well, because I reflected a lot about this. She's talked about attention, you being able to answer adequately, committedly. But it's as if this were in a second moment of a decision. Because this political issue has a an issue within that comes before disputing the narrative. It's for you to be in a state that's hyper excited, where you need the answer at all moments, such as Trump or Bolsonaro or Putin, are always just dropping tons of false information, intentionally false, without any commitment to truth, to what we already know about narrative. It has just fallen. There is no more worry with the truth of the narrative, of what's true or not. So I think about how can we develop within our body an answer so that we don't answer to this without this being a numbness of the body. It's a very delicate balance, I believe. And I think it comes before the dispute of narrative. I think there is a need for the body to be the resistance, for you not to fall into this craziness. And so I really liked the seminar, this issue of attention maybe being a possibility of the space for resistance. But I don't know how either. I also would like to think more about this in other ways, other formats. Well, thinking about her speech and also about the responsibility and obligation, I will reinforce what the professor said, which is in the beginning where I started talking about the round table. We are all anguished for speaking, for belonging. So until the moment we can't recognize these values of belonging to a space, of values, of moral, of the responsibility, we will not change. Just as our colleague mentioned, until the moment we become aware of our values, our belonging, our space, we will keep staying within these dialogues and discussions, and nothing will change. Okay? I'd just like to thank what you said, and with regards to what you said, I also think that this narrative crisis is very serious. Maybe the narrative has fallen. I don't know how we're going to reformulate speech. Maybe reformulate won't be through discourse. I think art has been working on this for a long time. I believe that I really like this idea of the resistance in the body. I think this might help many of us to resist mentally and physically. But when you're in direct contact, as I am, with people that are losing their physical integrity due to violence, well, this just goes to a whole new dimension, which I don't have words anymore to express. I would like to say that this is why we have to create communities and create belonging, because we now have to deal with this together and also defend those that are more fragile in the situation. So it's a mix of knowing how to be strong, to be feeling good, to know how to stand, as well as being together.
There's another definition of attention that I'm taking from a philosopher named Andy Clark, working a lot with cognitive neuroscience stuff. And he understands it to be a ratio between upstream and downstream input in any given situation. And what that means is it's the ratio between what you're taking in from the world as new information and what you're imposing on the world as structures of expectation that you already have. And the higher the weight from the ground up input, the upstream, the more attention you're paying. And the higher the weight that's placed on the downstream expectation, the lower your attention. Which is to say that attention is an antidote to, or the opposite of prejudice, if prejudice is already knowing. And that's really just by way of framing, I think, the promise of certain kinds of attentional practices as we might bring ourselves to them, even in circumstances like this. If we get good at paying attention, if we practice that in aesthetic circumstances and under aesthetic provocations, then we're training ourselves against prejudice. It's training rather than direct action, and certainly there's room to think about direction action too. But I think there's some power in that idea, again, that attention and prejudice are enemies.
I would like to make one very brief and quick comment. Jeff just said about the aesthetic experience as some sort of practice which leads to more broad sense of paying attention. And what I wouldn't like, it's like if we think about this aesthetic attention or about paying attention to the aesthetic objects, I wouldn't like to think about it as about any form of the escapism, like about escaping the real world. That's what Graham said yesterday in his lecture about this other part of the picture of Archimedes, that there is a true violence out there and that we just can't get, comfortably closed in our galleries and museums and theaters and so on. There is a real life.
So maybe Yael will speak for a moment. We have maybe about 10 more minutes. We only have a little bit more time, I think, because we have people who need to go to planes. So maybe we now try to begin to say a couple of things. This is all we have time for here.
I'll do it very quickly. So I'm overwhelmed by the direction the conversation has taken. And I want to say that I do think that if there is an answer to this so complicated situation, it is in attention that is stemming out of obligation. But I think, and I'm pessimistic in the service of hope, as we said it, I think that unfortunately, obligation is something that is organic to fascism and not organic to democracy and liberalism and left-wing state of mind. Because we do not think in unison. We think as individuals and we cherish pluralism and we cherish individuality. So if there is a solution to this problem that is a global problem, and believe me, I feel this problem in Israel where the discourse is very populist. If there is an answer, then it must be in finding a way to take upon ourselves the attention of obligations, while finding a way to preserve pluralism. And this means that we actually need to be more quiet and not necessarily to speak more. And to allow just a few of us to set a tone. And this is against all and I'm talking against something that is so obvious in this room, that everybody feels an urge to be a speaker. But I don't think that it will work, unless we will be able to put our faith and trust in some of us to lead. It is very problematic to say that, and I'm sorry to say that.
It would be great if attention would be the cure for prejudice. It would be amazing. But in countries with such a deep inequality like Brazil, before that, there will be the need of the will of having attention at the first place. But in Brazil, we don't have even that, because people in Brazil of average middle class. They hate the lower classes. We have the hate of classes in Brazil. It's very common to see that, and people don't even realize that they hate people of color and that they hate lower classes. So that there isn't even the will of having attention. So the will of attention is the primary work that we have to have before even having any kind of attention. So I think the ear and the listening is deeply biased. So I think it's before having any kind of attention, we have to understand that attention is deeply biased by many kinds of issues, class issues, color issues, gender, all the things that we are already tired of talking about. But attention is like a luxury. Attention is a luxury.
We have only about 5 minutes left, so it hurts me, but I think now it falls. I would like maybe Gabriel to say a few words, if you can, for a moment, and then maybe there are a few more words that can be spoken, and then we need to, Steffi, you would maybe come in on this, and then we need to wrap, I'm afraid. Please forgive me, but Gabriel.
Sure. I guess I'll speak this in English with apologies to the Portuguese speakers. I'm going to try and see if I can weave together several questions that seem to potentially make a thread and focus the answers on the specifically on the biennial. Not because I think the biennial is the answer to those questions, but I think that many of the questions were directed that way. So there was a question about the timing of attention, the timing of art, the timing of people, and that was one of the main questions that informed the creation of this edition. In a way, the opportunity to present art on this scale to this many people in this strong an institution seemed, if it was before having any thesis to prove, it's an incredible lab to think about that encounter between art and people. Right? There's very few opportunities you're going to have in your life to do that, where people don't pay an entrance fee, no one asks you who you are, you can spend a decent budget making it happen and involve the people that you believe in and trust and think will be your good partners on the project. So all of those were incredible conditions that it seemed to me would be wasted on me trying to tell you something about anything. It seemed that it would be much more interesting to deal with it as a lab, as an ongoing research project. And that was certainly the intention. We may have failed or passed, I don't know, and that's in everybody's individual evaluation. So what were our enemies on this path in making this a lab situation? One was suddenly prejudice. The people believing that we know what art is, or that we can speak from a position of knowledge or authority. Another is discourse, the sense that what matters is what we say about things and not what actually happens. So these are very big beasts to wrestle with, and none of them are easy. And we're trained to do the opposite. We're trained to judge things on their discursive power, on their specific political position, and I mean political in the narrowest, most ridiculous sense of the word, not in its real sense. And then what I think is a certain paternalism about the audience and its potential, and that's where I think attention is actually very powerful. We tend to think that there's a biennial that is visited by hundreds of thousands of people. That seems to me to be the wrong way of doing the equation. If there were 900,000 people visited the last biennials, that meant there were at least 900,000 different biennials, because each person constructed their own experience of that. And so even the attempt to try to classify or judge in a yes, no, good, bad, seems completely ridiculous. Not but just the number of people, but also the amount of art. This is not a small exhibition with 5 things on the wall. It's hundreds and hundreds of objects that have an extremely different range, each of which with their own temporality, their own sensibility, their own potential. So that's one of the questions, how can you create that? So that leads to the next question, is what are the technologies that we can work with? The question was specifically about the technologies of art. I'm not an artist, but I can speak to some technologies of curating. One of them is the physical space. How does that viewer navigate? A viewer is eyes, but it's also feet, legs, body, voice. It's all of those things together. So if we don't meet those eyes in their body, I think the potential of attention and experience are extremely limited. If we're only thinking about the transmission of the, I guess it would be the downstream, you know, what we want to tell people, and not the capacity of that person to receive, then I think we're going to have a very difficult conditions for experience. So space is a technology. Mediation is a technology. The amount of time, the people in the space who can talk to you and listen to you, that's a technology. Listening is a technology that can be actively used through the entire process of planning a project like this. This question of where is politics, this was from the second I was appointed, this is not going to be a political biennial, and this discourse continues. I personally would like to disagree. I think that it depends where you locate politics. Do you locate politics in discourse? Do you locate it in experience? And I think this is what we've been discussing in many ways. If you locate it in experience, it's a very different kind of animal that you've created. It's an animal in which you have to listen to the results as opposed to be constantly declaring on the behalf of the other. So the politics are in questions of trust. What are the invitations to people? How does that consist? Where do you exercise power? How do you exercise voice, authority? Those questions. Bruno's work, I think, spoke very eloquently and very beautifully to that project. Had he not been trusted, that project would not have been possible. So there's a chain of trust that goes, in my ideal world, it goes all the way down to the person who views the exhibition. If you don't trust the visitor as being someone who can have a good experience, and I'm out in the exhibition looking and observing, and I'm deeply moved by the respect and the conversations and the experiences that people are having. I think it's a very humbling experience. The politics of sensibility, the politics of encountering views that are different from your own. So even the exhibition does not try to define one type of art making. It actively in its projects tries to create multiplicities of sensitivity and make that evident in the space and in the artists. The politics of encounter, how do you come across those things? And ultimately, I guess the politics of affect. How do we use our affect? How are we affected by the things that we see? And can we create minimal conditions to think about that and to reflect on that? So those are very much sort of what the intentions were. And it reminds me a little bit of what Yvonne Guevara was talking about, this sense of interdependence. But interdependence from an embodied, personal, deep experience, that we can, within that, recognize our interdependence. So I don't know if that sort of tried to bring together several threads, but I know there's several that I didn't answer and I perhaps am not able to answer.
Speak a little bit first.
Thank you, everybody, for all your thoughts. It's fantastic to hear all of them. So I have to admit, the more I hear the word attention, the more anxious I get about attention, because, you know, it is obviously such an important thing, and I think all of us have less and less of it. And so I'm wondering, you know, I'm always wondering about ways of how to get out of the dialectics of, you know, for example, in politics, about left against the right, and, you know, the left does one thing and the right reacts, and then the left reacts even more. So how do we get out of that, and how do we possibly also get out of this demand to pay attention to things that want to convince us of something, such as memes or WhatsApp messages, or some that want to sell us something, and how do we somehow protect that space, or maybe even not pay attention? I don't want to propose another dialectic as a solution, but I think it might be a sort of, one possible, step on the way to something. I've been discussing quite a lot with people about, strategies that the right has been using in terms of memes, for example, and that they have occupied our attention so much, and how the right has been very good at using the visual regime on the internet, and has totally appropriated also the algorithmic regime, which was initially, somewhat of a new area in which it was hoped that marginalized groups, for example, could have a say. I mean, there was a big sort of feminist, cyber-feminist early net culture, for example. Of course, that has not happened at all, and it has immediately been adopted or subsumed in a way by commerce and commodified. So I've been discussing with friends whether the left should perhaps learn how to meme, and apparently it is learning how to meme. I think, however, I mean, it's totally paradoxical, because memes, in a way, depend on leftist ideals. They lack authorship, they are free, they are distributed widely, etc. So the left has to somewhat relearn to do that. However, I don't even agree with, that we should just counter the same the strategies of the right with the same strategies, because, and I think this is what Yael just said, that obligation comes from a more of a fascist sort of or right-wing discourse than from the left openness. I think these can all be somewhat temporary strategies or tactics, but I don't think they can be the final solution. So this is somewhat not giving an answer perhaps, but putting together some of the thoughts I've had during all of your comments. Another thing I wanted to say is about space and, headspace perhaps, or like reclaiming attention for ourselves. Vivian said, well, who can pay attention? And I spoke about this also during my talk and asked, who has the luxury or the, possibilities to pay attention? And maybe there is a way to, because I think, in a way, I, for sure, am still privileged in, if I chose to turn off my Instagram, I would probably be able to pay better attention. But how could we expand that privilege to others as well, and give space and listen, etc., and perhaps also allow the forms of attention that are privileged to take different shapes, to not be this kind of. I mean, I don't even believe necessarily that slow attention is the right thing. I think interesting things can come out of distraction. So it's but how do we want to shape them, and who is shaping them for us? Is it algorithms and companies, Cambridge Analytica, politicians, etc., or does it come more from a collective space in which not the ones that always spoke are speaking again?
So I also want to thank everyone for all the things that have been said. Thanks, Steffi, for all her work on this, and thank Gabriel for this biennial. Thank Dora. Thank everyone who made this possible. But I want also, as we close, to take one sort of moment of attention to what we've achieved even just here in this conversation, which isn't going to immediately change conditions of injustice. But without a moment like this of belonging to a common conversation, it's hard to know how questions of justice are even thought. So maybe just a moment with this moment. And then I feel some obligation to try to speak to Denise Milan's question. She says, so attentional practices, techniques of looking, of being with, of making time, of reaching toward. There's something political about it, you're telling me, but I need help. I'm paraphrasing your question. And that was a concise, I thought, version of the question many of us have been feeling toward or calling out. And I can only try to speak to this from my own commitments or passions. Here's what I believe. We know that human beings have polluted the planet. We've made a world that is physically toxic in many, many regions. You catch a fish in the sea anywhere, and it's got mercury and heavy metals and toxins in it. A pregnant woman can't eat that much of it because it's poisonous. We all know that the air we breathe is full of poisons. Human beings, we, capitalism, industry, yes, but us, let's just say humans, have poisoned the physical earth, our environment, and we've made it toxic. This affects our bodies. We're trying to become more aware of that so we can address it, which is very important. I want to propose to you that human beings, we, capitalism, industry, structured through technologies, have significantly poisoned the space of the spirit. What it's like to be a human in here. We have a toxic environment for being in our minds and with each other. And yes, the body, yes, for sure, the body, there's something primary about bodies being broken or undernourished. But the spirit, the mind, the ability to want what one wants to want, the ability to want what one wants to want. Freedom, emancipation consists in that, being able to want what one wants to want. And it takes a certain kind of being to make the space to want what one wants to want. This is primary. This is a condition of possibility for any politics of free persons. And I consider practices of attention to link to the political through that phrase I used on our first morning. When my graduate student wrote, "What are you trying to achieve?" And I said, we're going to try to salvage the human. We're going to try to protect a non-inhuman person. A non-inhuman person. And the only way to do that is to have a being that is capable of paying attention to something. If we don't start with a little bit of practice there, they've got us. And the toxicity of the world we're living in that makes us crazy. So in this sense, yes, there's something privileged about looking at a painting, for sure. One has to be healthy enough to get to the painting. One has to be able not to be so hungry one can't think. These things have to be taken care of. And those of you who are working for that in your lives, we all need to be grateful to you, and we all need to work more toward that. But if you've got that body, and the mind is owned by anybody who can flash stuff in front of you and get you going this way and get you going that way, the ability to want what one wants to want, a condition of it is attention, linked to responsibility, a condition of care. So we can only do what we do here in museums and as like kind of people who care about art, but There's a form of art that's political because it tells us what we need to keep hearing. And there's a relationship to art, there's a kind of art that reminds us and creates conditions for us being the kinds of persons we need to be. And my sense is that it's this that that Gabriel has had kind of in mind in this project, and I think it's serious, and this is what I think Steffi has had in mind in bringing us this symposium. So maybe I'm torn, because like on the one hand, it feels right, of course, to applaud, but also it feels maybe also right to leave the room thinking, not just kind of celebrating. So maybe I can ask you is it okay to say without your hands? We've done lots of clapping. We don't use our hands now to clap for Steffi, for Gabriel, for Dora, for the people who've made this possible. We thank them, and we leave like thinking. Thank you.
Can I add a person to thank you, which is Manuel over here, who has coordinated every little detail of it. So I was silent. Thanks to you also.